So I'd now like to go into our next speaker, who is Richard Weller, and it's a real pleasure to have Richard here with us on our 50th celebrations. Those of you who've been here over the years, he's been shared his knowledge with us a number of times. He is the Mayerson Chair of Urbanism and Professor and Chair of Landscape Architecture and the Executive Director of the McHarg Centre at the University of Pennsylvania. He's former co-director of Room 413, a design firm working across scales. Weller's work is well known to all of us, but his most recent research concerns global flashpoints between biodiversity and urban growth. And it is this global challenge that he will discuss with us today. So I'm pleased to welcome via Zoom, Richard Weller.
I'll take it if you can. All good? You can see the slides. Coming to you from my kitchen in Philadelphia. Wish I could be there, it'd be great fun, but just can't be. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you on the occasion of your 50th anniversary. It's a big deal, and it's an honour to do this. I'm going to speak about really big things, and I know that when people do this, it can be kind of irritating. Not least of all because it makes us feel small and incapacitated. And well, yeah, of course, because as a species, we've now become so big that we all feel small and incapacitated as individuals. But we have to stay with that feeling, because the personal and the professional anxiety that it causes, I think that's central to how we cope with the shock of the Anthropocene. And the scientists and the humanists are scrambling. It's almost like an intellectual panic to try and understand what's happened and what we've done, really. So, how we cope with the shock of the Anthropocene is obviously nothing could be more important right now. And or if you prefer, you can call it the capitalised thing if you want to start apportioning blame. That's okay. Either way, it's a climate change world. My sense of it is that the Anthropocene as the outcome of modernity is kind of a world we had to have before things can get better. The Anthropocene then is less the end than it is the beginning of a deeper ecological consciousness. And ecological consciousness is not a fast thing, it's a slow, almost evolutionary process. I mean, we're entering an era where every molecule counts, where everything you consume has a history and has a future of effects that need to be taken into account. We're moving into an era where everything needs to be redesigned. An era where every square metre of ground is being contested and needs to be planned. So without shying away from the problems that we face, I'm going to also show that there is a reason to be optimistic, both as citizens and as landscape architects, and that is without smearing green Vaseline all over the lens. We don't need to produce these landscapes that keep pretending to be innocent and paradisical. Everyone knows it's bullshit and we should stop. I want to begin really this lecture with the world's biggest cliche, which is of course the planet itself. Now, I love this image because it's the same world with two different sets of information. It's the same vantage point. So you see here the world accurately represented, but highlighting two different sets of information. And this is what I refer to as the problem of the two worlds. On the left, you see an urbanised planet, the result of a 10,000 or so year process of agricultural, architectural and infrastructural expansion. And this in the Western canon is of course what we call culture. in the world on the right-hand side, you see only the archipelago of the world's protected areas. This is an ad hoc collection of over 250,000 fragments of remnant habitat fenced off from the extractive landscapes that surround them. We're the only species, I guess, that has to fence off territory from itself. This in the Western canon is what we, for want of a better word, or for no word at all, is what we call nature. Now, returning to the world on the left, you could say the process of urbanisation is an evolutionary success story. The human network has colonised an entire planet, and from a distance, it appears to be bustling with more life than ever. And yet, in its current fossil fuel formulation, it is now clear that in its success also lies its failure, unless it can evolve to a more sophisticated phase of symbiosis. At the moment, it remains essentially parasitical. And, you know, none of this is unusual. Species do this. They thrive and then they die out. No species lasts for more than 1 million, perhaps 2 million years before disappearing into oblivion or evolving into something else. So if that's a biological law, then we are about 1/5 of the way into our story as a species. And so the advent of the Anthropocene raises the stakes on how we want the remaining 4/5 to essentially play out. And it's not just our demise that's at stake here. What we now have to worry about is also everything else, because our success has been and continues to be at the expense of everything else. Well, everything except microbes, some domesticated plants, food plants, cattle, sheep, pigs, and of course pets, dogs, cats, rats, and cockroaches, etc. But in the light of that, the human being has become nature's warden and nature's executioner, and that's existentially a horrible place to be. And, you know, it's just as well animals can't speak. I mean, imagine what they would say. Now, to avoid this extinction crisis, the two worlds on the screen need to be better integrated in a mutually constructive, less parasitical manner. Now, we all know this. It's really landscape architecture 101, but its conceptualisation as a new political, economic and spiritual worldview and its practical realisation are not so simple. And, of course, meet resistance at every point. Culture is profoundly conservative. And that, at the moment, is profoundly unhelpful, you could say. Now, what is different to the historical phase that we're entering is that the process of deeper human integration into the fabric of the Earth system, from genetics to mega-regions and perhaps even the atmosphere, is that everything is being designed. And the big challenge facing the so-called landscape in the context of an urbanising planet is to house, simply enough, and sustain a population of at least, 10 billion people sometime this century, probably more. And then you have to add to that figure, you know, a number of climate refugees, and so you're looking at having to house something like, let's just say, for argument's sake, 3 billion people this century. So, you know, that's about 350 New York cities which need to be built in the next 80 years. It's about 1 New York City every 4 years, let's say. Now, as it happens, we can do that. It's not actually such a big deal. We're really good at building stuff. Building stuff's not the problem. Changing the way in which we build stuff is the problem. And so there are 3 big changes required. The first is, as was just previously mentioned, adjusting to sea level rise. This map shows you what the world would look like if all the ice melted. The second big challenge is decarbonising the economy, and the third big challenge connected to the second is transitioning to renewables. Now, there's a bigger challenge that I'm going to get to, but speaking ecologically, the good thing about urbanisation is that it tends to eventually slow population growth. So, you know, urbanisation is a violent process, and you see it happening now, and you think, oh my God, you know, it's rampant and it's destructive. Yes, but eventually, one of the positives of urbanisation is that it does put a dampener on population growth. And so it's possible to foresee an urbanised world, say sometime in the 22nd century, with a global population that starts to move, it stabilises and then even declines. And that should, in theory, ease some of the pressure on the Earth system. Now, that said, of course, people that live in cities tend to also have large ecological footprints. So it's not just a matter of how we design our cities per se, it's about how we also design and manage their supply chains. And I think that was one of the central insights of landscape urbanism, and why I think it's important that the profession and the academy doesn't shy away from urbanism. So, to the biggest problem of all, and which is going to by far be the determinant of the global landscape. If a global population of about 10 billion people consume food as people in the developed world do, which is as they should in an equitable world, then according to today's agricultural practices, my back of the envelope calculation is that we would need around 90% of the Earth's terrestrial surface to produce the crops. So just let me say that again. A global population of 10 billion people, which is a modest number, if they consume food the way we in the developed world do and take for granted, we would need 90% of the Earth's terrestrial surface to be farmland. Now, given that 30% of the Earth's ice-free terrestrial surface is, in fact, currently desert, this means you have to green the deserts, hook them up to desal plants, and turn them into vast monocultures. And that's a worry, because the planet of monocultures is not only ecologically very brittle, it's also aesthetically and spiritually moribund. So, turning back to the world of so-called nature, at exactly the same time that we need every square metre of land if we're going to create a global equitable food bowl, the biologist Theo Wilson called for 50% of the Earth to be set aside for biodiversity. And maybe, for a perfectly healthy planet, he was right. But he never really said or explained where this land should be, or how it would work as something separate from humans. Now, in reality, and some of you would know this, what is happening under the aegis of the Convention on Biological Diversity is that the 196 nations of the world who are signatory to the Convention will probably soon agree to a new target of 30% total global protected area. New Zealand, incidentally, already has something like 30% protected area, depending on how you define protected area. There are several categories. I mean, New Zealand is in that regard a model of a future world if conservationists were to have their way. So, to the figures, if we reach 30% global protected area, as seems likely, and if we then add the 30% that is currently desert, it leaves about 40% of the Earth's terrestrial area, ice-free terrestrial area for food production. And that's about what we have now. But again, the problem is out of the footprint of the agricultural land that we have now, we have to feed a whole lot more people. So, it ain't going to look like paradise. Nor will it just be a case of technology to the rescue. Certainly genetics will play a role. Certainly a breakthrough will be if we can produce meat or nutrition that is protein that is completely independent of ruminants. So, maximising yield will be the aim. Otherwise, as I've explained, it's an apocalyptic scenario of effectively turning the planet into a monoculture. Now, as it is now, since 2010, the agreed target under the Convention on Biological Diversity, known as Aichi Target Number 11, and like the Japanese city, has been to reach 17% protected area. Now, here's the catch. That 17% can't just be anywhere. You can't just say it's New Zealand or it's out in Siberia, we've got a big patch out there, we're done. The Convention stipulates that the 17% must be representative of the world's 867 ecoregions, and more challenging still is that these representative patches should also, according to the Convention, be connected so as to open pathways for all species to migrate and adapt to climate change. So taken seriously, this means reorganising land use on a planetary scale. And 196 nations, including New Zealand, have effectively said, yes, we will do that. So, here you have landscape architecture's 21st century Macarian mandate. And yet, surprisingly, I guess, next to no landscape architects are working on the national action plans that nations are required under the Convention to make. So, with that in mind, my research over the last decade has been about auditing this process and trying to apply design intelligence to the triad: urbanisation, species representation, and landscape connectivity at scale. And when we began this work in 2014, the world's terrestrial protected area total was hovering around 13.5%, so there was a long way to go in terms of reaching the 17%. Now today, the total protected area is 16.64%, which leaves only 0.36% for us to achieve in order to meet the 17% target. Now, the deadline for that was 2020, but it's an ongoing process, of course. Now, you think to yourself, well, 0.36% to finally meet the 17% target, it's not much. Well, in fact, it ain't nothing. I mean, it's the equivalent of 150,000 central parks, right? And so if you put those central parks end to end, for example, you would have a landscape corridor, perhaps not wide enough, but nonetheless a corridor, that will circumnavigate the Earth 15 times. Now that seems to me to be a resource and opens a design question. So the question is then, where, as a matter of priority, should these 150,000 central parks be located, and what form should they take? So the common sense answer, I think, and most people in the scientific community would agree, although there are differences of opinion, of course, the priority areas should be the biological hotspots, regions where unique endemic life is most threatened with extinction. Anyway, the hotspots after evolution, the libraries after culture, and we're burning them and bulldozing them as we speak. Now, the problem is that when you take a map of the protected areas, here's the current global protected area estate. I mean, while we've been designing little things in inner city areas, this is what conservationists have been doing. It's incredible. And however, the problem is, as I was saying, if you look at the hotspots are shown in beige, that browny tone, and you see the protected area as areas of green, protected areas, they really don't coincide. So it's like the conservation community, for all the good work they've done, they kind of missed their target. Now this is because conservation is a political landscape and everything's happening in an ad hoc, manner. And it's very opportunistic. So when we audit land use in the hotspots, we find that 21 out of 36 do not meet the 17% target. They fall well short. And then you can zoom in to find again and conduct the same order in the eco-regions, and you find that 221 out of the 391 eco-regions in the biodiversity hotspots do not meet the 17% target. So this map is really saying the conservation dollars should be channeled into these particular areas as a matter of priority. Now, again, at this scale, New Zealand does really well in terms of the eco-regions, although things aren't evenly distributed, but where you fall short, according to when we did this mapping in 2015, at least is the Kauri forests and the Canterbury Otago grasslands falls short, but there's still plenty of remnant habitat there as a resource that you could put under some form of protection. Now, the point of this is that a fairly simple mapping procedure can help influence where the conservation goal should go, as I said, but more importantly, it can start to lay the ground for landscape architects to work on the land use planning that, as I said previously, nations are obliged to produce under the convention. Now, to do that, what needs to be taken into account, of course, is a clear spatial understanding of the conflicts that are involved between biodiversity and human activity. The front lines of this conflict are the intersection between habitat and agriculture, of course, but also the intersection between urbanisation and related infrastructure and habitat. And so the second phase of my research has been about trying to engage the urban side of that. We haven't come to the agricultural aspect yet. It's something yet to do, but we've worked on the urbanisation interface with remnant habitat and endangered species, and that project is known as the Hotspot Cities Project. The map that I'm showing you now is a hammer. I mean, you see the biodiversity hotspots in dark green. Every yellow dot that you see on this map is a city as defined by the United Nations of 300,000 people or more. And it's highlighted in yellow because each of those cities is sprawling directly in conflict with the rangelands of endangered species and remnant habitat. And that mapping is based on Karen Sibo's work at Yale. We've projected it out to, or she projected it out to 2050. We've just superimposed the endangered species and habitat piece. So over 90% of the cities in the world's most valuable areas of biodiversity are growing in direct conflict with biodiversity, and very few of them are doing anything about it. Right? Not all of these regions, but many of them are corrupt and poor, and this is very difficult terrain to work in, and goes under the radar of the international planning and design community. And so it's my contention that the profession of landscape architecture can and should do something about it. Sprawl is a cultural phenomenon, it's not a fait accompli, and it can be mitigated if one can credibly show that development should take place here and not there. In a word, design. And to that end, what we've done is narrow this sample set down, or narrow this set down to a sample set of 33, which you see here marked in red dots. And these maps are then, we zoom into each of these cities, these 33, and map them in greater detail. Wherever you see red on these maps means conflict between urban projected growth after 2050 and endangered species and marine habitat. And then from here, what we can do is we can go into these cities and serve as and treat them as case studies and develop design propositions, which is where the rubber hits the road. And we can do that for cities that are with planned economies, and we can do it for cities with informal growth. You need to worry about both of these types of urbanisation. Here, for example, is a plan for Bogota, capital of Colombia, for Bogota's imminent growth to 2050. And we don't have time to go into this, but suffice it to say the plan emerged from giving biodiversity and urban logistics and urban form equal weight in the process, and then trying to and compromising the two together to get an urban plan for the whole city. Now, so as I said, this is just the urban side of the story. The other is the direct conflict zone between agriculture and habitat throughout the hotspots, which is work that's yet to be done. So, I've spoken briefly about representation and urbanisation in the world's biodiversity hotspots. Now I want to turn to the question of connectivity. and answer the question of where best to land those 150,000 central parks needed to meet Aichi target number 11. And the answer to that takes place along 3 lines. The first is one from southeastern Australia through to Morocco, a second from Libya up into southern Turkey, and the third is from Patagonia to Alaska. Now these lines do a lot of work. That is simply enough for our walking trails, walking and cycling trails, so low investment, low risk, and yet they connect, just with the evidence of the line, essentially they connect 19 of the hotspots, they connect 55 nations, and then these lines, what we've done is map this in much greater detail. These lines connect, they thread the needle, as it were, on as many protected areas as they can. And this project is called the World Park Project. And yes, I do worry about the name, so if anyone's got a better one, I'm all ears. The point of the World Park is not just to turn the world into an adventure playground for students and poets and conservationists. Its real purpose is to incentivise and galvanise funds for the landscape restoration of all of the denuded land in between the current protected areas. And that's, of course, how you achieve connectivity. So, you know, it's on the one hand just a walking path and a cycling path, but the real ambition of this project is to marshal resources for landscape restoration, and particularly as we now enter into the decade of restoration according to the UN. Now, if we could do something like this, this would create something that's greater than just the sum of its parts, and would pull together what is currently still an ad hoc global conservation effort into a single project, I suppose. The World Park then is really about labour, you know, and it's about citizen science, and it's about indigenous landscape cultures on a planetary scale. And I think that's kind of profoundly optimistic. It's also radically site-specific when you get on the ground, but at the same time it's planetary, so it's top-down, bottom-up. At least that's the concept of it. This slide shows how it works. This is the what we call the Pataska Trail from Patagonia to Alaska. And if I zoom into that, you see how the trail threads the needle on the protected areas. And then the individual projects, I'm marking here with stars, pick up all of the denuded landscapes in between those protected areas. And through that work, you can achieve connectivity. Now, the World Park might seem to some like neo-colonial megalomania, well, it isn't. Humans have created numerous systems of connectivity at a planetary scale, and it's high time to create one made of green infrastructure that serves multiple species, not just our own interests. The World Park is also not an eccentric idea. It is part of a new wave of large-scale conservation-related projects taking place worldwide today. My research partner, Rob Leventhal, and I call these mega-eco projects. And the map that you see on the screen shows most of the active mega-eco projects happening right now. At the beginning of this presentation, I promised something optimistic. This is it. We've identified now over 200 live projects. These are not just reports saying we're going to do this, that and the other. These are live projects. And they tend to fall into 4 categories, which you can see along the bottom. Landscape connectivity projects, watershed plans, anti-desertification initiatives, and metropolitan projects. Metropolitan projects, by that I mean whole city initiatives vis-à-vis climate change. And you can see a cluster of red crosses around China. That's picking up all the sponge city. The Chinese are investing billions in the sponge city concepts. That's the kind of thing we're talking about there. Now, these projects are all, in theory, in principle, and even in practice, restorative. They're not extractive. That's a big difference. And I think that they're happening is extraordinary, it's historical, and it's profoundly optimistic, as I said. And however, at a time when the environmental process is so overwhelming and the Anthropocene is creating such anxiety and we feel so small and incapacitated, it's tempting to look at these things and see them as a form of salvation, but not so fast, right? As academics, what we're doing at the Mackay Centre at Penn is trying to sort out what's greenwashing and what's not, and trying to work out what might constitute world best practice with these. Because this is a new breed of mega project, and the reason we're calling them mega eco projects is to hold them within that tradition of the mega project, which is problematic. Mega projects, by definition, blow their budgets and fail on many other fronts. And so these projects, because they could do the same, only in green, and so we're trying to learn about that process. Particularly historically, the anti-desertification projects are problematic, many of them. So these things are not brand new, they do have history. The other purpose of looking at this kind of work, I think, is to build the case for landscape architects to be more involved in these projects. I mean, these are in essence landscape architectural, and yet, insofar as we can tell, the profession is barely involved in most of these big issues. So, to conclude, what I want to put to you on the occasion of your 50th birthday is that New Zealand itself is a kind of a mega eco project. In fact, it's much smaller than many of the actual projects that are going on today in the world. And New Zealand could lead the world in the historically significant experiment of reconstructing ecosystems and feeding large numbers of people and transitioning to renewable energy. And so today, if you haven't already, if I may be so bold, I would suggest a good thing to do would be to form an interdisciplinary team to undertake a well-funded, high-profile study of New Zealand's carrying capacity and present the public with a range of scenarios as to what the country could look like in 2072, which will be the year that the Institute celebrates its 100th anniversary. So with that, I'm concluding. Thank you very much for your attention and congratulations on the 50th. Cheers.